the real measurement has to be internal, right? Like you need to play the game of life from the inside out, not the outside in. Because if you make your ability to allow yourself to feel joy contingent on the achievement of those results, it now becomes a very difficult game to win. But if your standard is I'm going to give my absolute best, that now becomes something that's within your control. That becomes a real standard you can hold. It becomes something that you can really be honest with yourself of, am I doing this or not? And it becomes a situation where you can feel each and every day that pride and that fulfillment that, yes, I am showing up in the world the way that I want to show up.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Voices of Liberty. I'm your host, Sean Themea, and today's guest is someone who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a long time. But before I introduce them, you've probably had a horrible boss, or at least the fear of having a horrible boss. In fact, this is so widely understood as an undesirable situation that they made a movie about it in 2011 called Horrible Bosses. So, on my first day at Young Americans for Liberty, about 10 years ago in our DC office, and I met my first full-time direct supervisor, I was pleased to find that he wasn't just a guy who demanded excellence, or somebody who cared deeply about the cause of liberty and the mission that we set out to do. But he's someone who I felt was genuinely invested in unlocking my innate human potential. And some might say there's no greater sense of freedom and liberty than being able to channel your human potential, your X factor, and use that for the change you want to see in the world. And he has continued to unlock people's human potential and break down their barriers in his next venture. So our guest today is our former executive vice president of Young Americans for Liberty, the founder and CEO of mentalhealthcoaching.com, and someone who we're going to talk to today about leadership and how to break through to achieve the lasting change you want in your life. Please welcome to the show, Ty Hicks.
Hey, Sean. Glad to be here. Good to see you again.
Great to have you here. So I love a good origin story, right? How did you first come to the ideas of liberty?
Yeah. Well, not surprisingly, and similar to a lot of people, I got very invested and I was on the other side of the political spectrum for a while. But what I really remember was being a teenager and first starting to wrestle with those questions of what did I really want to do with my life and what kind of person did I really want to become? And there was just this big gnawing, nagging idea that created a splinter in my mind that basically made me realize that in our very limited time on this planet, you can either sort of exist is the way that I thought about it, or you can dedicate your time, your energy, and your life to trying to make the world a place that's better than you found it. And to me, I just kind of saw that that was sort of this option, you know, where we can kind of go into autopilot and live very unintentionally, or we can really make sure that we are digging deep, being intentional, trying to bring our best and trying to serve a greater cause beyond ourselves. So I think it was really more about that, like dedicating life to service. And then for me, it was then figuring out what was the vehicle or vehicles for making that happen. And so I got very curious, started looking to all sorts of different philosophies and then political philosophies and so forth. I thought socialism was going to be the answer. And then, you know, the overwhelming amount of data just obviously shows that, you know, as a general rule of thumb, the more free people are, the more prosperous they end up becoming. So if we want to improve the quality of life of especially the most disenfranchised pockets of society, we need to ensure that we create an environment of political and economic freedom in order for people to have choices. And I'm a big believer that human suffering is directly related to how few choices that we have. And the more choices that we do have, the more we can allow ourselves to create that prosperous future, and we can enter into voluntary exchange and all that good stuff that, you know, liberty-minded people know and love. So that was the kind of the initial inspiration for going into that world.
Now, some might hear that and think, this guy sounds like an objectivist. Would you identify as an objectivist, perhaps?
No, although I don't think I identify as an objectivist now, although I will admit that I developed an insatiable hunger for knowledge at a pretty young age, and especially like worldly philosophical knowledge. I really wanted to understand my place in the world and how to just make sense of this thing called life. And so I remember one of the first major influences that came into my life was Ayn Rand. I had one of those rare high school teachers that really cared a lot about their job. You know, like when you look back on your high school years and you're like, man, that was one of my favorite teachers. Anyway, he handed me Atlas Shrugged, and he wasn't preaching or forcing anything on me. He just was like, I think this would be something that would spark some ideas. And I absorbed it like a sponge. And that was a big part of my personality. I've since diverted from objectivism in a couple ways, but yeah, that was a big philosophical influence at one point.
Yeah, you seem like a man who lives without labels. If you had to stick one on yourself, what might you?
Well, I guess just in the spirit of total transparency and honesty, I, ultimately identify as an anarchist, so anarcho-capitalist. I'm a big believer that the more freedom, the better. Obviously, that raises a lot of concerns and objections from people, and that creates good, meaning debates. But if I had to reduce it down to that, it would be that. But I like the word voluntarist. I'm a big believer that human beings can create amazing, beautiful, fantastic, enduring things when they are uninhibited in their natural pursuit towards their own and collective goals.
Well, with that trigger word of anarchist, I think the FBI is officially now listening to Voices of Liberty. So that's tremendous.
Well, I've been on their list for years, I'm sure.
Beautiful. Now, some might say anarchy is chaos. It's potential for destruction and a destruction of order. What would you say to those naysayers?
Well, I don't know if I'm the best person to defend the political and philosophical merits of the philosophy of anarchism. I think another guest of yours would be better suited for that. My area of expertise in making the world a better place has not admittedly been in my intellectual and academic capacities. So I'm sure, there's one particular essay, though, that I will recommend to anybody, especially the people who are liberty curious or those people who really hold on to that idea that we absolutely still have to have a central government and et cetera. There's a gentleman named John Hasness you might be familiar with. And he has a really amazing article called The Obviousness of Anarchy. It's about a 10-minute read. And basically his entire argument is that people treat anarchy as if it's this extreme idea, as if it's, this controversial, hypothetical, theoretical thing that would be this giant risk or gamble for society, when actually it's the opposite. When you look at what human beings do and how human beings operate in the world, the vast majority of how we operate is anarchic, right? As in, we don't have a centralized committee. We don't have a centralized form of force dictating the majority of our choices, but yet still somehow by just being free to choose, we tend to move things in a better direction, right? So that's a really fantastic article I'd recommend for anybody.
The Obviousness of Anarchy. Check it out.
Yeah,
wherever you get your essays.
Yes, and you should get John Hasness on this show if you can. He's a great guy.
Oh, hey, if you got his line, we'll reach out. Now, that might be a great segue into talking about leadership, right? You mentioned people can operate without central government, central command. Perhaps it comes from within. Tell us, how did you first step into this concept of leadership, right? Were you born as a leader? Did something happen that made you say, hey, I want to be a leader. I want to lead from the front. What was that turning point for you?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say, I think it began right around that same period of time I was talking about, 15, 16 years old or so. And I think what happened was I really just became very disenfranchised with the status quo. I think every libertarian can kind of relate to that sort of carnal urge to want to revolt against how things have, how you're told things have to go, right? Like being put in a box, so to speak. And so, I grew up in this, kind of podunk town that it's not a memorable place or anything like that. It's just kind of an average situation. And I looked around at the lives that most people were living there, and it just was not the way I really wanted to live. And so it got me curious about exactly how blank of a canvas do we all have to paint on with this one life that we're given. And I think that started to open up my mind to the ideas of creating something new, right? Pushing past an existing barrier and seeing exactly how far you could take that thread. And so I've always been very drawn to philosophies like existentialism, or basically any sort of role model or source of information out there that is communicating some type of an idea that there is more within us. Those are always the most inspirational figures. And I'm deeply fascinated by people, say, like, Gandhi or MLK, like these people who just were ordinary people, really, right? But then they did something amazing and extraordinary because they tapped into some sort of innate set of psychological tools, right? It's almost like they were all looking at the world in the same kind of way. So I've been deeply fascinated with the idea that we all have a massive amount of potential, and that our sort of task on this planet is to figure out how to unlock that. There's been different influences over the years that have kind of fanned that flame, but I think that revolt against the status quo, not wanting to settle, not wanting to accept just the bare minimum, has been a big part of my personality.
Yeah, you mentioned Gandhi, MLK. Tell us more about who shaped your view of what it means to be a strong leader.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I will say that for me, I was very hungry for role models growing up. I had a lot of people in my life that taught me a lot of things, but interestingly, in the journey I'm in right now, the chapter of the journey that I'm in right now, was especially, I'm realizing that there was not that sort of one sort of singular big masculine role model in my life that I could kind of emulate and learn about the virtues of being a good human being, being a good man, things like that. So I really sunk myself into the personal development world at a pretty young age. I mean, you and I were working together at Yale, and we were both kind of going into that effort. You asked, what caused the pursuit of leadership. I think a big part of it was just necessity, right? So I joined Yale, and here I am now in a position where I've got to lead people, right? Like if I want to make a difference on the world, right, that's the ultimate goal of my life. Well, now what follows from that is that there are a series of skills that are going to be necessary for me to master in order for me to make sure that I make that difference. So I don't think I was born a leader, far from it. In fact, I was a very insecure, shy kid, right? I've always been very introverted and all those kinds of things. So I've had to push against my better nature to make sure that I'm actually communicating in a way that leads people towards a different outcome. So starting as, leading just a little Yale chapter on my college campus, and then, rising through the ranks of Yale, and then finding myself at the age of 22 managing, a 6-person full-time staff and, $1.5 million budget. And it immediately made me realize how much I didn't know. And so I had to kind of pour myself into the world of absorbing information, testing new strategies, and learning basically every single thing that I could. So a couple role models that have always stood out, Tony Robbins, the great Tony Robbins, has really set me on my path in a lot of great ways. There were some people that I followed back in the day a little more closely, that represent that early 20s hustle mentality, Jordan Belfort, Grant Cardone, those kinds of people. Thankfully, I've now gotten influences from a whole variety of different places now in the past decade, and widened the flexibility in my approach. So it's not quite as narrow as it used to be.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a point you just mentioned about, you stepped into this full-time role, national field director and later executive vice president, and you realize you didn't know as much as you thought you knew. And I've heard you say before, when advising leaders and people want to break through, that the moment that you think you know it all is when you stop growing. So tell us about that. How can people check themselves on, thinking they know it all?
Yep. There's a quote that has been ringing in my ears in a new way recently. You know how sometimes you'll hear something years ago and you'll go, oh yeah, that's really nice. And then it's really like 6 or 7 years later, you're like, oh wow, now I really get what that was saying. And I studied Stoicism for quite a while years ago, and Marcus Aurelius is a very interesting figure to study historically and philosophically. But he has this quote where he says, take whatever comes to you as woven in the fabric of your destiny, because what could more aptly fit your needs? And so when I think about humility and leadership, and this is an area where I still have room to grow, admittedly, I haven't mastered it, but my big belief is very often the person across the table from you will reveal yourself to you, right? So if you're in a state of openness, you now have the ability to pitch and catch. You have the ability to become stronger for that. So as I've been consulting with some of the members on the team in the past couple of weeks, for example, I've had to come into the conversation knowing, okay, I know the result that we're after, but I don't fully have all of the information and context to advise on the decision that's going to get us that result. So let me gather as much information and context as I possibly can. And I think that 10 years ago, right, when I was first stepping into a leadership role like that, I think I would have come in a little too headstrong, and I would have said, well, here's exactly what we're going to do, without first making sure that you are aiming, and then firing with everything that you've got, right, at the right target. So I think the humility piece is a big part, but that's one of the areas I still have some room to grow for sure.
Yeah. You know, there's an old Japanese saying that says there are three faces that you wear. The face, right, you show yourself. The face you show the world, and the face you show when you're pretending to be a different person to your boss and therapist, right? How would you react to this statement?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting, even just like in this experience, in this conversation, like I'm aware of there being a little mask on, you know, like the video guy mask that we all like to be into. So
to be clear, not a COVID N95, right?
Right.
Mandated or not mandated, right?
That's right.
The visible mask.
Yeah, you're touching on one of my favorite things in the world to talk about, which is I'm a big believer that we don't interact with the world directly. We interact with our mental model of the world. And so what ends up happening is people project that mental model onto the world, and that mental model basically says, well, this is how life is supposed to go. And a part of that mental model includes, this is who I am supposed to be. And so speaking in terms of barriers and restrictions and all those types of things, the number one most restrictive thing on a human being's life, I have found, is actually not the law. Well, it can be in some extreme situations, right? But for the vast majority of people, especially living in America, the thing that limits us more is that limited mental model that tells us who we have to be versus who we can never be. And that therefore defines a narrow set of choices that we feel like we have to live in, kind of creates a mental box, basically, that we feel like we have to live in. And so that's been the interesting exploration since I left Yale as a full-time staffer, now diving headfirst into that world and seeing how all of these little microscopic moments we had when we were trying to convince college activists to take more action on campus and to believe in themselves and organize and pursue their passion and get out of their own way, so to speak, how all of those little psychological patterns that we were learning how to navigate as leaders now were just these sort of tiny little glimpses into exactly how deep those limitations can be that people create for themselves mentally.
You mentioned the fact that people feel like there are people they can told they can never be, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, for sure. So when I have a new client, right, or someone that might be a client of mine, someone who comes into my world in the mental health coaching world, one of the first questions I'll usually ask them, if they come to me and say, hey, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling whatever. One of the very first questions I'll ask is I'll say, okay, growing up, whose love did you crave more, your mom's or your dad's? Not who did you love more and not who loved you more. Whose love did you crave more? And it's the shortcut to that answer is whichever parent gave their love less freely. And so I'll ask people that. Someone will say, oh, my dad. I'll say, okay, great. So your dad's love was less freely flowing. They'll say, yes. I'll say, okay, who did you have to be for your dad growing up? And they'll inevitably say something like, well, I could never make a mistake, or I could never do anything to upset him, or, well, I had to be perfect, right? Those are some very common answers. And what most people don't realize is that urge to be loved is the dominant, singular, evolutionary thing that defines who we craft our personality around, right? Like that urge to receive love and keep that safe source of love from your parent is such an ingraining force that we use that as our dominant filter for deciding who do I need to show up in the world as and who can I never show up in the world as. And so people will fall into what we call the archetypes. There's basically like 6 or 7 archetypes, right? So one is, the perfectionist, someone who could never have any kind of a flaw. Another one is the pleaser, somebody who was told at a very young age, you can't do anything to upset me, don't upset me. And so on from there. The caretaker, people who feel like they have to solve everyone's problems. So there are these common scripts that human beings get themselves into, common boxes, if you will. And what ends up creating anxiety, depression, or just limitation for people is almost always when they're wearing that mask you were talking about. All right, they've been so conditioned to wear this mask because they've convinced themselves, unless I'm showing up with this mask, I'm going to be punished. People are not going to love me. People are going to hate me. And therefore, most people are not even like really in touch with who they really are, like at the greatest core. And my big belief is that the fastest way to be miserable is to live life as someone other than who you are. And so we end up trying out for roles that we're not meant for, and living inside of the skin of these masks that we've kind of created. And that's the ultimate limitation. So if we become aware of those and then we expand past that and we realize that we actually have a much wider set of options available, that in and of itself becomes the fastest path to a more free life in terms of, just improving our overall quality of life, even more so than raging against the government, which, don't get me wrong, I'm all for, of course.
Yes. Yeah, no, I can relate to trying out for roles that you never fit in, because I still can't get into any productions of the musical Cats, right? I think I'd be great, but apparently I don't fit in. But this all falls into a theme that I know you discuss a lot, which is, getting unstuck. And people, have you found, not even realize that they're stuck, or people get stuck and perhaps, prefer to be stuck. Tell us more about getting unstuck and that condition that you've observed many people in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the core organizing belief that I approach my work with is that if there's something that you want in your life that you don't currently have, it's because you have at least one limiting belief in the way. And so I always think about this one story, right? And if you've ever been to the circus, you've seen these, giant elephants. And most people have had the thought enter their mind of, why the hell did the elephants put up with this shit? Why are they just being led around the ring by this, 150-pound man when this elephant could easily tear down the entire thing, escape, and go live their life?
Yeah, maybe a great benefits package, 401k, full health coverage.
Peanuts, right? Yeah. So besides the peanuts, no, but what they do is it's kind of sad, really, but they take a young elephant, right? The young elephant, they take a stake, they put the stake in the ground, they tie this big rope around the elephant's trunk. The baby elephant tries like hell to break out of pull the stake out of the ground. The baby elephant's not strong enough. Baby elephant tries, eventually concludes, I can't take the stake out of the ground. So it stops trying. Now the baby elephant just lives its little life around this little stake. Baby elephant grows up to be a big elephant. Big elephant is now way more strong, way more capable. But the problem is not that the elephant cannot lift the stake out of the ground. The problem is that the elephant created a belief a very long time ago that it cannot lift the stake out of the ground. And so most people are living, not most, all of us are living that exact situation. It's just a degree to, the only difference is how many stakes have we convinced ourselves that we cannot pull out of the ground, right? And so I think that the interesting and beautiful and challenging thing about the human condition is the opportunity to identify those invisible stakes that you didn't even realize were tethering you, and then to learn the set of skills of pulling them out of the ground, realizing that you actually had the ability to do it all along. That's the deep fascination. That's where I feel like a mental treasure hunter when I'm working with people, because it's about finding where those little limitations were that people didn't even realize, the walls that they put up for themselves a really long time ago. And like, if we go back to those archetypes, for example, if I have convinced myself, like I'll use myself for example. So my archetypes were the achiever and the pleaser, right? So I got rewarded at a young age for doing exceptional things. And I got told at a very young age, Ty is going to be, he's so smart, he's so this, he's so whatever. And then the other big reinforcer for me was anytime I showed vulnerability, that was not welcome. And so, and also I grew up in an environment where if I upset my stepfather just a teeny tiny little bit, then it could be a big explosion immediately. And so I associated a lot of pain to causing harm in other people, even inadvertently. And so that caused me to be very timid and cautious and reserved. And it also caused me to be very isolated and singular in my pursuit of success, right? The challenge with that, though, is that becomes very limiting. That becomes a set of boxes, right? There's an advantage to that, right? There's things that's brought in my life, but then that's brought disadvantages where it creates loneliness at times, or it creates the inability to allow yourself to feel what you need to feel, right? Things like that. So those are all, that's been part of my journey, is reclaiming that wider set of choices. And I think that's the process for all of us, is figuring out which box have we put ourselves in, and then what therefore have we sworn off? What have we said is not allowed, right? So, sometimes people who are very reserved, they're not giving themselves permission to just be free and silly and have fun. And that will become anxiety inducing over a period of time. So it's different for all of us, but I think that's the path.
That's great. And again, this is all in the context of identifying barriers, breaking free from barriers holding you back to unlock your X factor, unlock your potential. And some might say that is freedom, right? And one of those barriers are the stakes that we hold ourselves to.
Yeah.
Now, a homophone of stakes is stakes, right? And stakes make me hungry. And I remember one video that you had shared with me early on, my first couple months on the job, which is different from talking about barriers holding you back and more about, the pursuit of motivation, right? And being in touch with, motivation. It was a guy named Les Brown, and the video was centered around, you gotta be hungry, except he sounded more like, you gotta be hungry, right?
Yeah.
So tell us more about what Les's message was and how you can apply that in unlocking your potential and pursuing what the impact you want to make.
That's a throwback. I haven't seen that video in a long time. Yeah, I remember him being like, you gotta stay hungry. That's great. I think I would have a different answer to that now than I would have back then when I first showed it to you. I think that, and for anybody who's wanting to be more, which is everybody, right? We all want to be more. We all want to be at our best. We all want to see what we're really capable of. So we're talking to everybody here. I think that when you start acknowledging that you want to be more and do more, there's kind of a series of stages of what you realize you need to do in order to make that happen. And I think kind of level one is that embrace of the grind and hustle mentality, right? Like, I'm just going to crank it up. I'm just going to, give everything that I've got. And I think that's a very easy mentality to go into, especially in your early 20s and things like that. So I gravitated towards those messages of just do it, grind, hustle, stay hungry.
Shia LaBeouf mindset.
Or Shia LaBeouf mindset. Yeah. And to me, that's great. Like, sometimes that's what you need. Sometimes you do need just a reminder to stay hungry. Like, that's a cool thing. But I think that what I've found is that if you're just grinding, there becomes a challenge with that. And I think I ran into that maybe right after I left Yale and when I was starting a new venture for the very first time. And what I've learned is that in most cases, the reason we're not moving forward, if we talk about getting stuck, for example, the reason we're not moving forward is not what we think is the reason. We think it's because we're not pressing on the gas hard enough, if that makes sense. And so I think that most people get themselves in that attitude of, I just got to summon more. I got to somehow just try harder. But that then creates this huge amount of tension. It creates this, it creates wasted energy is what it really does, and then that creates exhaustion. And what I've actually found is that most people are not moving forward, not because they're not pressing on the gas hard enough. It's because they didn't even realize they had the emergency brake pulled at the exact same time. And so rather than us trying to, pour more coal in the furnace, let's take weight off the boat kind of thing has been more the attitude that I've had. And I've realized that, you only have so much energy to go around. Like Bill Gates, for example, he a very interesting guy. And there's advantages and disadvantages to how he does things, but he will try to solve big world problems, right? And what he does sometimes is he goes and does these think weeks for only a week, or for a week, he'll just totally focus on one problem. He's like, I'm going to, get rid of cholera or whatever. He'll read every book he can possibly.
Still have cholera? He thought for a week.
I forget what it was. Now I'm going to make myself sound stupid. Whatever. He's wanting to get rid of diseases and do all these different things. And I know that, he's not always the biggest fan of liberty, obviously. But anyway, my whole point, though, is that he's realized there's only so much you can focus on. Right. There's only so many mental calories that you have available. And so rather than trying to add more to your plate and think that that's going to, become the way to a better life, I think of the quote now, which is from Antoine I always pronounce the last name wrong, French philosopher guy. But he said, perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to be added, but when there's nothing left to be taken away. And so when I think about breaking barriers, getting unstuck, moving things forward, I think much more in terms of isolating what the obstacles are and just removing those rather than let's just summon a bunch of willpower and sheer force to try to plow through them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And one of the barriers that I think is present that people need to remove if they want to succeed in advancing liberty, communicating liberty, getting others to take action from liberty, joining their movement, is the barrier of not being strong enough in the art of persuasion.
Sure.
And, as you may have noticed, right behind you is a chalkboard from the play Glengarry Glen Ross, famously says, always be closing, from the Alec Baldwin monologue. And I think that a lot of people have a predisposition to maybe avoiding the study of persuasion or not leaning into their potential in this skill because they have preconceived notions of, I don't want to come off as a snake oil salesman. I don't want to twist people's arms, right? I shouldn't have to persuade someone if the idea is good enough. What would you say to that? And what are your comments on the merits of studying persuasion to unlock your potential?
Yeah. So I think everyone does need to understand it. And it's basically non-negotiable, really, right? If you want to be a human being that has any level, I mean, hell, forget even having an impact on the world, which I would certainly hope everybody would want to have that impact on the world and make it a better place. But if you even just want to navigate this world and you want to have any decent modicum of success, you're going to have to learn to be persuasive. I mean, if you want to be a parent that's effective, you have to learn how to persuade. If you want to be in a effective relationship, you have to learn how to ethically lead and persuade from time to time. And that also means being open to being persuaded too at the same time. If you want to be a leader of any sort in any sort of company or organization, of course, you're going to have to learn that. And when you and I first worked together, speaking to what we were just talking about a second ago, I realized that, okay, we got to get people to take action, right? If we want to build a movement, it really kind of comes down to us getting as many people to take action as we possibly can. And so the study of the art of getting people to take action takes you into that first layer of hustle and grind and bring all this confidence, and there's a lot of good things in there. Like, Grant Cardone, for example, would say that, he would say sell or be sold, for example, right? As in, the person who has the most confidence and the most certainty in an interaction is going to influence the other person so long as there is rapport, right? And I think that in those early days when we were leading the team, we probably leaned a little too heavy on the just, be confident and assert yourself. And it almost had this sort of twist people's arm attitude to it, even though that's not the spirit of what we were trying to do. But we were just so hell bent on trying to make sure we got people involved in the cause in whatever way we could. And so we were just trying to, summon all of this energy to persuade people to make it happen. Now what I realize is it's not about getting people to want to do something that they didn't want to do. It's actually more about framing the thing that you want people to do as the thing that's absolutely in their best interest, but being very truthful about that. I think my attitude on it in the past was that sort of always be closing, like just get it done kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Now what I realize is that, first of all, you shouldn't be trying to get someone to do something that they really don't in their heart of hearts really want to do. So it really becomes a matter of this person does want to do this. Like, for example, in the context of YAL, okay, we've identified somebody who cares about making the world a better place, a freer place. They clearly, of course, have capabilities, but they don't see their capabilities necessarily, or they don't see the path. They don't see the way to actually take their inspiration to make the world a better place and turn it into a reality. And so the art of persuasion in that case is not, come on and just do this thing. It's, let me make sure that I'm allowing you to see in your own mind how you can walk down this path. So I gave this example when I was training the state chairs. I talked about this idea of a river bank, right? So, let's say you've got a river and there's all of these people on one side, and then there's us on this other side, and you're trying to get as many people as you can from their side over to your side. So in this case, right, joining the liberty movement. In order to do that, though, they may want to cross the river. They very well probably do. Or in the world that I work in mental health, it's like that person does want to go for the job interview, or they do want to go and date again after their divorce, or they do want to go to the gym and get themselves in shape. There is a better life. There is a better outcome that they want. The problem is not that they don't want it. The problem is they step up to the riverbank of uncertainty. They step up to this riverbank and they go, I'd really like to get across, but I just don't see the way. I don't see that that's possible for me. And so really the job of a leader, I think, is to help build the bridge, right? Help them build the set of beliefs that they have to be able to adopt in order for them to naturally see that set of choices is available to them, and to frame that opportunity in such a way where they realize that is really going to be the opportunity for their better life, is to pursue this avenue that you're presenting in front of them. Mm-hmm. So it's not about creating desire. It's not about, getting somebody to sign on the dotted line. It's about recognizing this person is headed in this direction. They really want to go in that direction. How can you make sure that you show them that your path is a faster, better way for them to get the outcome that they want? And then that's how you make sure that they're not going to resist you long term, right? Because no one is influenced by somebody who's just trying to get them to do a thing for their own benefit. But we all are very open to being influenced to get what we want in a faster, better way. And I think that's how you create more sustainable long-term trajectory with those people that you're leading, right? You want to make sure that they're going to be their own self-rolling wheel of sorts. And the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if you're making sure that you're aligning your opportunity behind what they value deepest and most. And if you can connect those two, and you can help them see that by pursuing this opportunity you're presenting in front of me, I get to be more of who I really want to be in the world, then that's what really glues people to things.
Yeah, perfect case study. My fiance framing me helping clean up the house as something that I actually do sometimes, occasionally.
There you go.
I certainly don't like to do it, but I end up doing it because she's created the right framing.
So how did she frame it to you?
It's the notion of, I care about doing nice things for her and contributing to the relationship and being a good partner, right? And so if that means picking up a popcorn kernel,
yeah,
I would much rather let the kernel just sit there and sprout into a beautiful popcorn tree. I'm a hardcore environmentalist, but it's, happy wife, happy life.
Real quick before you go on, I think that one thing worth people considering, and this is a tangible, hopefully a takeaway people can use, is I'm a big believer that what we call work is just activity that we don't associate an empowering meaning to. So it'd be very easy to think of cleaning your house as work or a chore or something like that. But in the case that you just gave, right, what's really happened is you've now created an empowering meaning around that activity. You've related that activity to being the type of man and partner that you really want to be. And so it doesn't feel like work as long as you've got that frame around it when you're doing it.
Yeah. So one of the other first principles that you've really at least marked in my mind as important, and something I think about often, is the notion of you get what you tolerate, right? Now, how should people who want to make an impact for liberty interpret that statement? How can they apply that in their day-to-day?
Yeah, I will put a preface on this that I'm a bit of a crazy person. And so
only the best people are. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've had to realize that not everybody has to care as much as I do. about things. And so when I first came into Yale and was in that leadership role at 22 or whatever, the big frustration for me was, why isn't everybody working as hard as I'm working on this, right? There were plenty of hard workers, right? And that's the thing. But I had this blind spot. I had this scotoma. I had this frustration that would show up regularly of, why isn't everyone giving 110%, right? When we have the opportunity to do that.
You see someone giving 105, you're just like, pathetic.
Right. And so what that caused in me is, it caused me to be at times a bit of a impatient and unelegant leader, right? So I would kind of, a lot of that, you got to stay hungry attitude, right? You can only shove that down people's throats so much. It just doesn't.
You try that for me in the Les Brown voice.
No, I'm not going to do that.
I already did it. So
right.
Yeah.
But, you know, for people like you, for some people, they really latch on to that. And that's the message that they need to hear and they need to receive. But not everybody wants to dedicate. So for me, let me put it this way. For me, my ideal vision of an ideal life for a long time has been, I'm dedicating every single ounce of my energy that I have available to making the world a better place. Admittedly, I've come to the realization that that belief in and of itself was a box that I was kind of putting myself in, where I was not allowing myself to experience other aspects of life, like just joy, friendship, things like that. So I'm working on widening that a little bit, but I still am a big believer that basically every moment of your life, you should have an intention behind it. Not necessarily, you know, you should be working all the time, right? But every moment should be a hell yes or a hell no. Like you don't want to be living in that murky kind of area. So anyway, that's just the preface, because when I say get what you tolerate, I think about that a lot. Even you saying that, just those words are a reminder of like, yeah, you know what? There's things in my life right now that I'm tolerating that I need to not tolerate. And so there's always an ability to raise the standard a little bit higher. What I would say to people who are listening would be this. You're only going to be able to feel real fulfillment and real peace of mind, and you're only really going to have a fantastic relationship with yourself when you do what you say you're going to do. And so what I find is that for most people, there's a pretty wide gap between what they say they're going to do and what they actually do. And that gap illustrates the gap between how we're desiring to show up and then what our standards are, what we're willing to tolerate. So most people want to show up very differently in their life or in their activism, or they want to make a bigger contribution. I chatted with a gentleman who will remain nameless just recently, and I could sense in him this frustration. He was talking about how he'd been chasing paychecks and, you know, going down this career path, but I could tell in him that he had the spirit of an activist, right? And he's been involved with our group before, and he was hungry. He was hungry for doing something different. But what I could sense in him was that gap between, man, I'd really love to be making a bigger difference. I'd really love to be giving more, but tolerating giving less. And so what I would say is that everybody needs to have a very, very honest conversation with themselves and a look in the mirror. And they need to ask themselves, what is really the life that I want to lead? And that's going to include things outside of advancing liberty, you know, but to what degree is advancing liberty and making the world a freer place central to my life? What contribution am I going to be truly satisfied with myself making? And for me, I'll add on to that too, that I think in the past, I've gotten way too hung up on outputs over inputs. And of course, like I'm a big believer, you need to have results, you need to have targets, you need to have things like, for example, you know, again, I was just consulting with the team on the new goals for the campus department, like how is Yale's network need to grow for this upcoming year? So of course you got to have measurements, you got to have results, you got to have targets that you're driving forward. But I think the real measurement has to be internal, right? Like you need to play the game of life from the inside out, not the outside in. Because if you make your ability to allow yourself to feel joy contingent on the achievement of those results, it now becomes a very difficult game to win. But if your standard is I'm going to give my absolute best, that now becomes something that's within your control. That becomes a real standard you can hold. It becomes something that you can really be honest with yourself of, am I doing this or not? And it becomes a situation where you can feel each and every day that pride and that fulfillment that, yes, I am showing up in the world the way that I want to show up. And I'm also going to trust that whatever flows from me showing up and giving my best is what it needs to be. And there's, I'll wrap this up with, there's a quote I've been thinking about a lot. It comes from Taoism. And I forget the long version of the quote, but the basic essence of it is, those who attach themselves to their work will never create anything that endures. Your job, you simply must do your job and let go. And so to me, it's more about making sure that that standard is internal, right? And I think that for most people who are attracted to liberty and making the world a better place, like, we all know there are atrocities being committed in the world right now, right? Like, and in America, being an American libertarian, it's actually easy to get satiated and make your caring about liberty more of I like to call it like a hobby. I think there's a lot of people who treat liberty and being upset about tyranny and oppression, they treat it like a hobby. It's like a sports team for them almost. It's like, well, I'm on that team. Yeah, rah, rah. It's like, I watch the game on Sundays. Yeah, but are you showing up to practice? You know, are you lacing up your cleats? Are you donating to the team? Are you running the drills if you're on the team? You know, like, are you giving your sweat? Are you doing what you say, right? And saying what you do. Like, if you really say that you believe in the world being a freer place, and you really believe that people ought to be contributing to making the world a freer place, what I like to ask people is, cool, show me your schedule, show me your calendar. Where are you? Or show me your wallet. You know, like, what are you doing to make the world a freer place? And I think we all have room for closing that gap between the impact we want to have and then the standard of impact that we've been tolerating up until now.
Yeah, that's great. Very insightful. To close out this portion, because I want to make sure we talk about, mentalhealthcoaching.com and your work there, on the notion of leadership for liberty. Mm-hmm. If you had to boil it down, right? You're in the elevator, the door's closing, someone's saying, please just tell me as quickly as possible, how do I be a good leader? What are the mistakes I avoid, right? What's the immediate answer?
Yeah, very simple. I gave this answer too when I was training the leadership team a couple of weeks ago. I said, what is a leader? And I think a leader is just two things. A leader is somebody who has massive compassion for the people that they're leading and the highest standards of anybody in that group. So even if a leader is not assigned in a particular group, a natural leader is going to emerge by somebody who embodies those two traits. So we've talked about the standards, right? Because somebody who holds a higher standard than everybody else is pretty clearly going to become elevated in a leadership capacity. But the compassion part is just as important. The compassion part is making sure that you're coming from an attitude of, I'm not going to let you guys hold a lower standard than you can because I care about you too much. And I will admit that was a shortcoming of mine when you and I first met each other, when I was leading the team in my early 20s. I kind of understood the standard part, like, okay, push more, drive more, make it more. But I forgot that people are only effectively led when they can tell how much you care. It's that old adage, right? Like, people don't care what you have to say until whatever. People aren't going to listen to you. People aren't going to care what you say. They're not going to go in the direction you advise them to unless they know you really, really care about them, unless they know that you're telling them to do that thing for their sake, not for yours. Right. And so I think it's just those two things. I think you have to imbue your every leadership action from a frame of compassion. And I'm not perfect at that. No one's going to score 100% on that. Like, sometimes you get caught up in this just needs to get done kind of attitude, but you're going to be most effective as a leader when you embody those two things. And with my clients, maybe this is a good segue. This is the energy that I have to bring to my clients a lot. And it's one of the things that makes our work very different. And it's one of the things that causes people within their first 30 to 60 minutes of me, teaching them and showing them what they need to know, where people will say, we've gotten more done in an hour than I've gotten done in 10 years with my traditional therapist. And it's because I am willing to say the unsaid. I am willing to tell somebody something that displeases them so long as it actually serves them, if that makes sense. And I refuse to play small, and I refuse to placate and lie to somebody just because it's the polite thing to do, right? Like, I know that if somebody really understood that they have the choice in front of them of indulging in their current pattern or having that pattern broken and having the life that they really, really want to have, but in order to break that pattern, somebody's got to come and give a little bit of cold water splashed on the face. Like, they would rather have that outcome in the long term. And so I try to operate from that standpoint. And that's what makes you effective as a leader, is being able to say, I love you too much to allow this pattern to continue. You know, I care about you too much to allow the status quo to fester. We have to change. We have to raise the bar. We have to change this. We have to disrupt that system.
I think it's interesting that you called yourself out on, hey, I missed the boat to what I could be doing on the level of compassion, the level of letting people know I care. Because I led right off with, this episode and said, hey, I felt that, I believe that right away coming in. So I guess I just have really low standards for that. So I guess you're lucky. But no, I mean, hey, growth and honest self-assessments are the only way that we can keep growing, right? We can't lie to ourselves. Tell us what mental health coaching is. Why does it exist? Why are you motivated to lead it? How does this tie into, your understanding of liberty and freedom?
Yeah. So I have, as I said before, my main North Star in my life is, how do I make the biggest difference I can? How do I just make the world as better of a place as I possibly can with whatever my unique skills are? And what I tapped into kind of accidentally in the pursuit of becoming a better person, becoming a better communicator, learning personal development, so forth and such, leadership skills, what I started to realize was this whole science of getting people unstuck kind of came full circle for me. And it came full circle in the sense that when I was a teenager, I had horrific mental health, incredibly debilitating anxiety, suicidal depression. And it got to a point where I actually had a suicide plan that was all ready to go, right? And the only thing that stopped that happening was just kind of like a little act of God, or whatever you want to call it, that happened. And my whole life turned upside down. Basically, this elaborate plan I had to take my own life became discovered by my family. Immediately, I was hospitalized in a juvenile psych ward for 2 weeks. Basically, I got onto medication. I got thrown into traditional therapy. People were showing me ink blots, right? I went through the system, if you will, and came out of that. And those traditional tools did not really help me. I remember feeling very unseen. I remember feeling very misunderstood. And I remember feeling like this is not really getting to the core of the issue. But then what I also had happen was while I was in that psych ward, I encountered a young woman. She was probably 16, 17. I was like 13, 14 at the time. And she had come from a horrific background, but she was full of joy. And it was like that type of joy where you can tell someone's not faking, like you can really feel it. And, I remember she had these like bruises on her arms, and I was like, what's going on? Her dad was harming her, but yet she still had all of this like radiance and joy, right? And I was like, something doesn't compute here. And basically the realization I had was, okay, I thought I had the worst life. I thought I was the teenager in America that had everything the worst, right? Pretty classic situation. Here I have proof now that I don't. And it was this big breakthrough for me that, my depression is not caused by my biography. My depression is not caused by my life circumstances. What I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing and the very limited amount of choices I've convinced myself that I have has to be due to something going on up here, not something going on out here. And so that curiosity caused me to go down my own path of self-improvement and discovery. And that's what led to you and I, working together in our 20s and so forth. And so that fascination kind of came again full circle for me in my early 20s. And I started to realize there is a set of tools to overcome anxiety, to overcome depression, maybe even to overcome many other challenges that people think of as being these like lifetime life sentences. And that got me deeply, deeply fascinated with trying to find proof and real strategies and tools where people weren't just staying stuck in those patterns for years or decades. Because what I kind of came to the realization of was, wow, I overcame all of that stuff, but most people don't. And why is that? How is it that I was able to make that happen kind of accidentally? And how can I create a model, or how can I create a path where people can make that happen? So mentalhealthcoaching.com exists because the state of the mental health industry right now is in a particular place where we've got, of course, medication, we've got therapy, and those do work for a portion of people. But even if you just look at the data, like the NHS just came out with a study, I want to say it was in 2024, that basically shows that only 50% of people who do talk therapy find it to be sufficient for dealing with their anxiety. There was a study done, I want to say, by the National Institute of Mental Health in the past couple of years that showed that only 25% of people who use anti-anxiety medication or antidepressants find that to be sufficient. And so we're still in a stage where people are doing the same old stuff that they've done for decades. In the case of traditional therapy, centuries, arguably. There's some things that are still being done. And so it's outdated. And the whole paradigm that needs to be broken is this idea that anxiety and depression are permanent, lifelong, disorders and diseases that you absolutely just cannot do much about, and that you just have to cope with, and you kind of have to put up with. And what we do and have been doing now for years, and we've got now, I think, almost 700 documented case studies to show this, is within even just a matter of 2 to 3 months, if you do things differently, like if you do things the same way you've always done them, you're going to get the same crappy results you've always gotten, right? If you do things differently, and if you prioritize going to the real source of the issue, and you prioritize making sure that you have a set of skills and a system that really works, then you can make massive, massive changes. And so our typical client will come in with excruciating anxiety and or depression on day 1, and on day 90, they will report, they themselves will self-report that has been reduced by 75, 80, even up to 100% just by following a very different method. And so my big passion now is, how do we bring that to the world? How do we take this method that we've now shown that works and we've refined over the years, and how do we get this in the hands of as many people as we possibly can? Because if we do that, the world now becomes a much freer place, right? Because instead of people wrestling with their thoughts and anxieties and worries and going into survival mode, when you're in fight or flight mode all day, every day, it's impossible really to feel like you can dedicate energy to making the world a better place. So if we get rid of that very avoidable set of problems for people, we now free up a massive amount of human potential. We now free up a massive amount of energy that can be allocated. And that's why I see my entire life is going to be pursuing these two things, because they're completely the exact same path. Pursuing making the world a freer political place, and making sure that people are freer in a sense, mentally and emotionally, where they realize how much power and options that they have. And making sure that when people unlock the mental and emotional barriers, they're then encouraged to allocate that newfound energy towards making the world a freer, better place through various other pursuits. Like hopefully I'll be creating a foundation one day to help with exactly that.
That's tremendous. And I am glad that the plan was discovered and did not go through. I'm glad you are here with us today and the impact that you're making.
Thank you.
The MAHA, Make America Healthy Again movement, right? You often hear that framed around food or vaccines primarily. Have you found there's an intersection with that movement and your view of the state of mental health, where mental health needs to go? Has this ever crossed your mind?
No, it really has not. And I'll say this will surprise a lot of people because, obviously my first big chapter of my professional career was being in the world of politics and so forth. But for the better part of the past 10 years, I don't make a habit of watching the news. I don't make a habit of, checking the tweets of what RFK or Trump or anybody is saying. And my big belief is that you can allocate your energy towards what these other actors are doing that is outside of your control, or you can dedicate as many units of your available energy as you possibly can towards shifting the needles that you can shift. So no, I don't pay much mind to it. RFK to me seems like it's like rolling the dice whether or not he says something that I agree with or not. So no, I don't pay a ton of attention to that, but I do believe that the world of mental health needs a freer market of options and solutions, right? Like I'm a big believer that it's not one size fits all. I'm a big believer that there are definitely some challenges with kind of the pharmaceutical industry's relationship with government and how that tends to work. That creates a little bit of an institutional paradigm that limits our options and choices a little bit. I think that people need to be free to explore different avenues and different methods and figure out what that is for them. And so that trickles down obviously to insurance policy and all sorts of things like that. But my focus on a day-to-day basis is just how many individual people can I bring these tools and messages to, and just get those tools into people's hands so that they can start using them as much as possible.
Got it. Now, since you've been checked out of the news lately, I'll give you the rundown just in case you missed it. Donald John Trump is president, number 47. Previously, we had Joe Biden in his auto pen as 46. And Greenland's about to become the 51st state, whether you like it or not. So that's what's going on in the news today, since you haven't checked Twitter recently. We're coming to the end of our time here, but I want to ask, and you shared a little bit about this already with folks who will remain nameless, but what breakthrough stories are you most proud of with mentalhealthcoaching.com and the work you've done to free people from their barriers and unlock their potential?
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot of rock stars coming to my mind right now. One of the stories that touched me a lot was I got approached by a parent whose daughter was a 13-year-old girl with a very severe eating disorder. And she was kind of starving herself and was trying to, fit into this mental mold of what she thought beauty meant, and was destroying her body. And so within about 6 weeks, I was able to help her get past that. And she started, she was very healthy, well-adjusted. That was one that comes to my mind, because I think about that, being like a ripple. It's like, well, that now is going to ripple out for a long time, right? She's going to go and live a very different life. There was a woman recently, last year, and she's great. She's actually done a public interview with us. So she would have no problem with me talking about her story. But she was, I want to say, in her late 70s. She had gone through a divorce, and she had been alone for 30 some odd years. And talking about the elephant and the stakes, one of the beliefs that she had created a long, long time ago was that she was never going to have a successful relationship and that she was not worthy of love. And she was living a very, very lonely life in her assisted living community. And we went through all of her anxiety stuff. Within 3 months, she had developed a whole social circle inside of the community that she lived with. She found a boyfriend 6 months after the program. She's still with that boyfriend. She's in love. She's having a great time. And she's playing guitar like at 75 years old. She had always wanted to play guitar, but never gave herself permission to do it. So she's learning how to play guitar. And she's just she's just beaming with joy like every day. So that's one that comes to mind. One final one that comes to mind is a young woman who had a very severe anxiety issue, very severe anger issue, rage issue, and she had pushed basically everyone away in her life. And we dealt with all of that. And she had a major alcohol problem as well. And just by dealing with the anxiety, the anger, and the deep fear of being unworthy and tackling that, the alcohol issue solved itself. She's been sober now for 2.5 years. She's lost, I think, like 40 pounds. She's doing great. So there's dozens and dozens and hundreds of stories, more actually than I can even remember now at this point, which is a really beautiful thing to see and to say. So, but yeah, I'm proud of all of them.
That's great. Now, will you share with us as we close out here, for the person who wants to step up, maybe for the first time, maybe taking time off from being in the liberty space, but they want to make that impact. They want to make the world a better, freer place. Maybe they want to become the next voice of liberty and work their way up to being on the show. What would you recommend somebody who's in that position of, hey, I want to get started, but I'm not quite sure how? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say that you need to figure out what your comparative advantage is going to be in terms of providing the liberty movement with what it really needs. So there was a mental model that was given to me by one of my mentors at a very early age, and he called it the pyramid of social change, I think he said. And basically what he said is at the very, very top, you've got the intellectuals. You've got people, like Hayek or Bastiat or John Locke or whatever, right? People who are putting the ideas of liberty down on paper. And then it kind of trickles down, and you've got the people who are then interpreting those ideas and saying, okay, well, if we're going to apply those ideas in the public policy space, then this is what that might look like. So there's, think tanks, and there's also, and YAL is doing this too now with, model legislation and these different types of things of how do we take the idea of liberty? How do we translate that to a freer world in terms of legislation and law? And then you trickle down a little bit further from that. You've then got, the actual, politicians themselves, right? And then, below that, you've got society, right? So we want to make sure that the ideas of liberty are understood and shown to be demonstrably true, all the way down to, the average Joe Schmo, right? Who values those types of things. Because if we have a electorate that tolerates a low amount of freedom, that is what we are going to have. If we have an electorate, if the voting bloc of America, if we culturally change the amount of freedom we are willing to tolerate to be a much higher amount, if we hold a higher standard for that and say, no, you can't encroach on this, you cannot encroach on this, I'm not going to tolerate that, and we demonstrate we're not going to tolerate it through action, then that now puts pressure on politicians to act in alignment with the window that we've created. So I recommend everybody study this very simple but very powerful concept called the Overton window. It really just is the political interpretation of what we were talking about earlier with standards, and basically just says that we will have as free of a world as we tolerate having, not as free of a world as we desire to have. And so if you want to make the world a better place, you have to figure out, how am I going to influence the shift of that Overton window? How am I going to help create a situation where it is very clearly understood by the powers that be, by the people who make our laws and enforce our laws, that we are not going to tolerate a lower threshold of freedom than this. And I think there's different ways to do that. I think that, arguably you could decide that you're going to pick your place in the pyramid of social change towards the top, although I personally am a fan of the argument that we really don't need more people talking about why freedom is important. We just need more people insisting that freedom is permitted and protected. So I think we need way more help on the bottom part of the pyramid than the top. And that's why I gravitated towards organizations like YAL. So my real advice is, personally figure out what is going to be your own personal standard for how much you do give to liberty. And that can be multiple answers. It could be, yeah, you know what, I'm going to volunteer a couple hours on the weekend and I'm good with that. Cool. You should do that. If your commitment, however, if you're the type of person like me, where you're never really going to be satisfied unless you feel like you're giving your soul to your cause, then you need to hold a very, very high standard for yourself. But be very clear that you're creating symmetry between what you want that contribution to be and what your actual level of contribution that you're showing up as is. And I would say you need to also figure out which layer of that pyramid of social change do you want to pick as being your arena. And you then want to be the absolute best, most badass fighter that you can be for liberty in that arena. Hold a very high standard for yourself in whatever arena that you've chosen. If you do want to be an intellectual for liberty, okay, cool. You better tell us something we don't know, or tell it to us in a way that we haven't heard it before, or at least just make the ideas simple and palatable so that more people adopt them. If you're going to be in the legislative environment, you better be creating fantastic legislation that can actually pass and that is going to shift the needle towards a freer future. If you want to run for office, fantastic. You better be prepared to make sure that you're ready to really rip that open and make the most out of it that you possibly can. If you want to be one of the activists that YAL supports and empowers and recruits, where you're creating the political pressure that causes people to act and make the world a freer place, fantastic. We need plenty more of those people. But you got to pick a fight, and you need to decide you're going to be the best fighter you can be.
That's great insights. And I'll end with this, right? You mentioned communicating radical liberty ideas, right? Things that we haven't heard. I will say boldly, quote me on it, put it in writing, sue me if you want, but pineapple does belong on pizza. So thank you.
I agree.
Oh, good. You're an ally. You know, I would hate to make you an enemy, but Ty, thanks so much for being here and for being a voice of liberty.
Absolutely. It was great. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks for being with us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to Voices of Liberty on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, or YouTube. And to learn more about how you can be a part of the movement advancing freedom in our lifetime, visit yaliberty.org. I'm Sean Themea, and thank you for listening to Voices of Liberty, where we keep the torch of liberty burning by telling the stories of those who carry it forward. See you next time.